James opened the doors of the small pawn shop on a cold December morning. The biting wind swept through the streets of the small town in rural Texas, but he barely noticed the chill. The bell above the entrance rang softly. Echoing through the quiet room were shelves of old jewelry, time-worn watches, and items steeped in other people's stories mingled with the scent of aged wood. This place, which once brimmed with life and hope, now seemed to suffocate him under the weight of sorrow. The pawn shop, once a shared dream with his late wife, Clara, was now his only companion. It had been 5 years since she passed, after a long and painful battle with cancer. James still remembered every detail of those final days. The empty look in Clara's eyes as her body wasted away, the words she tried to speak, and her cold hand slipping from his for the last time. Since then, the man who used to smile with customers and find beauty in the little things had become a shadow of his former self. James now lived day by day, without expectations. The shop, once a symbol of a fresh start and a dream of thriving together, had become a reminder of his loneliness. He closed the accounts at the end of each month, kept the place tidy, but the passion that had driven him had died with Clara. That morning, he adjusted the wall clock, one of the last items Clara had chosen to decorate the shop. It was one of those old-fashioned clocks with a golden pendulum that swung slowly. Clara had loved that clock. "It'll mark our days of success, James," she would say, with that smile that lit up her eyes. Now, the ticking sound was a constant reminder of all he had lost. Despite the gloom, something within him couldn't completely let go. There were days when he wondered if what he did still mattered, if any customer really cared about the stories behind each piece of jewelry or pawned item. Yet the shop was the last thread connecting him to the past, to Clara. Selling or abandoning the place felt like erasing the final traces of her from his life. The morning dragged on slowly, and the bell rang again, signaling a customer. A young woman, with a lost look, hesitantly entered. She held a small gold necklace in her hands, delicate but clearly worn. James recognized that look. It was the same look many brought to him, a look of loss. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice rough, tinged with quiet kindness. The young woman, Emily, glanced at the necklace, then at James, her eyes filling with tears. This belonged to my mother," she began, her voice trembling. "She passed away a few weeks ago, and I'm trying to cover funeral expenses. I need the money, but I don't want to give it up forever." James nodded slowly. He knew what that meant. Emily's story wasn't unique, but each time someone entered with something so personal, he felt the weight of their choice. For them, it was a moment of loss, a farewell. For him, it was a reminder that the world didn't stop turning, that loss wasn't exclusive to him. He took the necklace from her hands, feeling the cool metal between his fingers. He looked at Emily's face and saw a familiar pain. He had been through it himself. Clara had always been his anchor, his balance. Losing her had made everything around him crumble. "I can hold on to it for you," he said, after a long pause. "You won't have to sell it. Pawn it, and when you're ready, come back for it. It'll be here waiting." Emily seemed relieved, but also grateful in a way that few words could express. She gave a faint smile and nodded. James handled the paperwork, noted the loan amount, and sent her back to her grief, knowing that in some way he was helping carry her burden. When the door closed and the bell rang again, James was left alone in the shop. He looked around at the objects lining the shelves, each carrying a story, a loss, a sacrifice. For a moment, he wondered how many more times he would have to see his own pain reflected in others. How much longer could he bear the weight of others' sadness without succumbing to his own? The clock in the corner continued to tick, and James realized that, like Emily, time wouldn't wait for him. He took out the necklace he had given to Clara on their 10th wedding anniversary, still stored in a box behind the counter. He held it for a moment, feeling a sudden urge to talk to her, to hear her voice, to feel her presence. But all that remained was silence and the ticking of the clock. James took a deep breath and closed his eyes. He knew he had to move forward, but moving forward wasn't the same as forgetting. And maybe he thought by helping the people who came into his shop, he was in some way helping himself. The day would go on, as it always did, but something in James had shifted. Over time, the shop's rhythm remained largely unchanged. But there was one noticeable difference, Valeria. At 19, she had joined the shop, full of energy, with bright eyes and an unwavering faith. Her presence, at first, was met with indifference by James. After all, he had long lost any trace of faith after Clara's death. But Valeria, with her youthful enthusiasm and seemingly unbreakable optimism, brought something James wasn't expecting, a hope he had rejected but couldn't entirely keep out. Valeria arrived on her first day with a smile on her face. Despite the cold weather outside, she was eager to learn and determined to do a good job. She greeted customers with genuine warmth, in stark contrast to James's silence. The shop, once so quiet, now seemed to breathe a little more life. "Good morning, mister." "James," she would say every morning, full of energy, even when he only mumbled in response. In her first few weeks, Valeria meticulously cleaned the display cases, organized the pawned items, and, most importantly, chatted with James about everything. But it was her faith that caught James's attention the most. She constantly spoke about her belief in God, about how each day was a blessing, and how everything happened for a divine reason. "You know, Mr. James," she said one morning while arranging a batch of gold rings, "I believe God has a plan for each of us. Sometimes things seem hard, but there's always something bigger happening." James barely looked at her, sighing deeply. "Valeria, that's nonsense," he replied, his voice full of skepticism. "If there is a God, he has nothing to do with what happens here. If he did, Clara would still be here with me." The silence that followed was thick. Valeria stopped what she was doing and looked at him, her face a mix of sadness and understanding. She had heard about James's story, about the death of his wife, and how it had left him bitter and disconnected. She knew his pain ran deep, but her faith wouldn't let her give up. Despite his coldness, she believed that, somehow, she could reach his heart. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Mr. James," she said softly. "But I believe Clara is in a better place now, and that, somehow, she's still with you. God doesn't abandon us, even when everything seems to fall apart." James let out a bitter laugh, almost mocking. "Clara's dead, Valeria. Death is it. There's no better place. Just the void. You're too young to understand that." But Valeria didn't falter. She stood firm, her eyes full of compassion. "I'm going to pray for you, Mr. James," she said, her voice gentle but resolute. "You don't have to believe in it, but I'm going to pray that, one day, you find peace in your heart." James shook his head, impatient. He didn't need prayers. He needed something real, something tangible. Praying wouldn't bring Clara back, wouldn't erase the years of pain he carried. To him, Valeria's words were just a hollow attempt to comfort the unconsolable. "Do what you want, Valeria," he replied, turning back to his work. "Just don't try to make me believe in it." As time passed, the tension between them continued to simmer quietly. Valeria, despite James's coldness, never stopped being kind, never stopped showing that there was something bigger to believe in. Whenever she could, she made small gestures of kindness, offering a cup of coffee when he seemed particularly worn out, or quietly mentioning that she was still praying for him. Despite himself, James began to notice something different about her presence. Valeria brought a light into the shop that he hadn't felt in a long time. She wasn't there to fill the void left by Clara or to erase the pain he carried. But her compassion and unwavering faith started to make James question, not about God, but about himself. Had he closed himself off so much in his grief that he had forgotten how to live? One afternoon, after a long and silent day, James found himself watching Valeria as she arranged the shelf of old watches. She was humming a quiet tune, something about hope and love, and for the first time, he didn't interrupt her with his usual sarcasm. Instead, something within him softened. Maybe, just maybe, this young woman knew something he had long since forgotten. "Valeria," he called out almost without realizing. She turned, surprised by the tone of his voice. She turned, surprised by the tone of his voice. It was the first time he had called her in such a direct way, without disdain. "Yes, Mr. James," she replied, with the same warm smile as always. "Why are you still here?" he asked, not hiding the sincerity of the doubt in his voice. "Why do you keep being so kind to me, even knowing that I don't believe in any of this?" Valeria smiled, but this time, there was a hint of sadness in her expression. She walked over to the counter where he stood and looked directly into his eyes. "Because I believe no one is beyond redemption, Mr. James. We all go through difficult times, but that doesn't mean hope is lost. I see more in you than you see in yourself. And if I can do anything to help you realize that, I will stay." James didn't respond immediately. He was caught up in his own thoughts, in the disbelief that someone could still believe in him when he had given up on himself so long ago. Silence hung between them, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with something James hadn't felt in years: possibility. Valeria returned to her work, but her presence at that moment had planted a small seed. And for the first time in a long while, James allowed himself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, the emptiness he felt wasn't eternal. That afternoon, the sound of the bell on the pawn shop door seemed more distant than usual. James was more thoughtful, darker than normal. In recent days, something had been bothering him, an uneasiness he couldn't explain. While Valeria organized some shelves in the back, he sat behind the counter, looking at an old portrait of Clara that he kept in a drawer. He didn't have the courage to display it, but he couldn't leave it at home either. It was a constant reminder of what he had lost. It was at that moment that the phone rang. The shrill sound broke the silence of the shop like thunder. James, a little hesitant, picked up the receiver and put it to his ear. "James Pawn Shop," he answered, his voice still heavy with exhaustion. On the other end, a serious and restrained voice echoed. "Mr. James, this is from Memorial Hospital. We need you to come as soon as possible. Your son, Mark, he's been in a serious car accident. He's in a coma." For a moment, James' world stopped. The words coming through the phone seemed unreal, as if they didn't make sense, as if they couldn't be true. He felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Mark's name repeated in his mind, but nothing seemed to make sense. "What? What do you mean?" He stammered, trying to understand, trying to process what he had just heard. The voice on the other end continued giving details, but James was no longer listening. All he could think about was that his only son, the only person he still had in his life, was on the brink of death. The world seemed to close in around him, and suddenly, painful memories of losing Clara began to flood him like an overwhelming wave. I'm coming," he said, abruptly hanging up the phone. Valeria, who had noticed the sudden change in James' demeanor, approached him slowly. "Mr. James? What happened?" she asked, concerned. James didn't respond right away. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on some random point ahead, as if his mind was far away in some distant place. Finally, he broke the silence. "Mark, my son, he's in a coma. A car accident," his voice trembled. The weight of those words seemed almost unbearable. Valeria looked at him, her heart aching. The compassion on her face was evident. Without hesitation, she gently placed a hand on James' shoulder. I'm so sorry, Mr. James. I'll pray for him. God is with you both in this moment." But Valeria's words, though filled with kindness and faith, stirred something in James that he had fought to keep buried. His face twisted in a mix of pain and anger. He brushed her hand away with a sudden movement, his eyes now flashing with resentment. "No," he shouted, his voice filled with frustration and bitterness. "I don't want your prayers, Valeria. Where was God when Clara died? Where was he when the illness devoured her and left me alone? And now Mark too? You think prayers will change that? Will they bring my son back?" Valeria took a step back, surprised and hurt by James' outburst. But she didn't let it shake her. She knew he was suffering, knew that the pain consumed him in a way that made him incapable of accepting any kind of comfort. Even so, she remained calm. "Mr. James, I know you're angry. I know it feels like the world is falling apart around you. But God didn't cause this. He's by your side, even if you don't realize it. He's with Mark now, and with you too. But James' anger only grew. He stood up from his chair, his body trembling with frustration. "Don't come at me with that," he shouted, his eyes now filled with tears that he refused to let fall. "God isn't anywhere. If he were, Clara would be here. Mark would be fine. But all I have is loss and pain. There's no one looking out for me. There's only emptiness." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Valeria could see the raw pain in James' eyes, the despair he tried to hide behind his anger. She knew she couldn't convince him of anything in that moment. Knew he was in the depths of an abyss she couldn't reach. But that didn't stop her from trying, from continuing to be the light in the darkness he felt. "I won't give up on you, Mr. James," she said softly, "and I won't stop praying for Mark, because even if you don't believe I do, I believe there's something greater at play, and that God can bring healing to your son." James didn't respond. He simply grabbed his coat and left the shop without looking back, the door slamming shut as he passed through the entrance. The drive to the hospital was a blur of confused thoughts and painful memories. With each passing mile, James' heart grew heavier. He remembered when Mark was just a boy, running through the yard, laughing with Clara. He remembered the nights they spent together, the joy Mark brought to their lives. And now he was lying in a hospital bed on the edge of death. When James arrived at the hospital, he was greeted by the sight of white corridors and the smell of antiseptic. The coldness of the environment only increased his anguish. He was directed to the ICU, where Mark was, and when he entered the room, he saw his son lying there, hooked up to a series of machines that kept his body functioning. James' heart shattered into 1,000 pieces as he looked at that once strong, vibrant boy, now so fragile. He approached the bed, feeling a mix of rage, pain, and helplessness. The tears he had been holding back finally spilled over. "Why?" he whispered, staring at Mark's motionless face. "Why is this happening again? What did I do to deserve this?" But there was no answer. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the steady beeping of the machines. James sat down beside Mark's bed, holding his son's cold hand. And in that moment, for the first time since Clara's death, he allowed himself to feel the depth of his sorrow. The weight of it was unbearable, pressing down on him like a physical force. He wasn't sure how much time had passed, but eventually, he stood up. He needed air. He felt trapped, suffocated, as if the walls of that room were closing in on him. He wandered through the hospital's cold corridors, not knowing where he was going. He walked past the hospital chapel, a small room where some patients and families sought comfort. He hesitated at the door, peeking inside at the dimly lit space, illuminated only by the soft glow of candles. Valeria was there, kneeling at one of the pews, praying in silence. Her head was bowed, hands clasped together in deep prayer. James stood there, frozen for a moment. Part of him wanted to walk away, to distance himself from everything he considered futile. But another part, a deeper, more desperate part, made him stop and watch. He wanted to believe, wanted so badly to hold on to something, but the fear of being let down again held him back. Valeria, sensing his presence, lifted her head and looked at him. There was a mix of surprise and relief in her eyes. "Mr. James," she began, her voice soft, filled with compassion. "You came." James crossed his arms, feeling awkward, not entirely sure why he was there. "I don't know why I came," he admitted, his voice rough and low. "Maybe it's desperation, or maybe I'm losing my mind. But Valeria," he hesitated, struggling against the lump in his throat. "I don't know what to do anymore. Mark, he's..." James couldn't finish the sentence, and Valeria, with a gentle look, stood up and approached him. "I know you're suffering, Mr. James, and I understand that you've lost your faith, but you don't have to go through this alone. Faith, for me, is about more than just believing when things are going well. It's about believing even when everything seems to be falling apart. God doesn't abandon us, even in our darkest moments." James lowered his head, still torn between his pain and anger. "And what do you expect me to do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Pray? Believe that suddenly everything will be fine just because I asked? I did that before, Valeria. I prayed for Clara, and she died. There's nothing more to do. Valeria looked at him, her eyes filled with understanding and compassion. Maybe it's not about asking for something, Mr. James. Maybe it's about opening your heart to whatever comes, to hope, to the possibility that even in suffering, there's still something that can be done. I'm not going to tell you that everything will be okay, but I can tell you that faith gives me strength when I don't know where else to turn. And you can find that too if you let yourself. Silence hung between them again. James felt an enormous weight pressing down on his shoulders, but somehow, Valeria's words didn't feel as empty as they had before. He knew the pain of losing Clara was still an open wound, but as he looked at Valeria's sincere face, something inside him softened. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was pride, but for the first time in years, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was something more beyond the pain. He looked at Valeria, his face marked with exhaustion, and finally murmured, "If you think this might help, then I'm willing to try, but I'm not promising to believe." Valeria gave him a soft smile. "That's enough, Mr. James. What matters is that you're willing to try." Together, they knelt in the small hospital chapel. Valeria began to pray softly, her words flowing with a calm, almost sacred in its simplicity. James remained silent, his eyes closed, not knowing what to say or feel. He wasn't a man of prayer, not anymore. But as Valeria prayed, something within him seemed to soften, as if the immense weight he carried was beginning to lighten, even if only slightly. When they finished, Valeria looked at him and said gently, "Let's go back to the ICU." James nodded, feeling strange but somehow lighter. When they returned to Mark's room, everything seemed the same, except for one almost imperceptible detail. The monitor next to Mark's bed showed a small but significant change. Mark's heart rate, which had been slow and irregular, was now more stable. James, confused, looked at the machines, then at his son, still in a coma. What's happening?" he asked, incredulous. Valeria smiled, her eyes filled with the same faith she always carried with her. "Maybe things are starting to change. Mr. James, maybe the miracle is beginning." James didn't know what to think. He approached Mark's bed again, held his son's hand, and for the first time in years, felt a spark of something he had long forgotten. Hope. Mark was showing signs of life. The miracle James had once denied, the one he had never dared hope for, seemed to be unfolding before his eyes. The following hours were a blur of doctors coming and going, running tests, and finally, a small but clear victory. Mark moved his fingers ever so slightly. It wasn't much, but to James, it meant the world. He looked over at Valeria, who smiled in the background, and for a brief moment, he allowed a tear to fall. Maybe, just maybe, he could believe again. After the devastating loss of his wife, James faces the challenge of his son's recovery after a life-threatening accident. Guided by Valeria's unwavering faith, he discovers a new purpose for his life, finding hope and love where he least expected. A story of redemption, transformation, and spiritual rebirth. If you were moved by James' transformation and believe in the power of faith, hope, and love to overcome even the darkest moments, why not share this story with someone who could use a message of renewal? Don't let the miracle of life go unnoticed. There is always a chance for a fresh start. Help spread this message of faith and hope. Share the story and inspire others to believe in new beginnings.